Hello, this is Steve Matthews speaking, but I'm also known as the Masked Amp. Relatives are often unaware of their right under Section 13(4) of the Mental Health Act to request an assessment of their relative. Under the Act, those who are aware are often under the mistaken belief that this will inevitably trigger a visit to their relative by an AMP and two doctors. Section 13(4) states, "It shall be the duty of a local social services authority, if so required by the nearest relative, to make arrangements for an AMP to consider the patient's case with a view to making an application for his admission to hospital. And if in any such case that professional decides not to make an application, he shall inform the nearest relative of his reasons in writing." The reference guide has very little to say to enlarge upon this, except to state that the nearest relative can require the local authority, verbally or in writing, to arrange for an AMP to consider the patient's case, including whether there is a need for compulsory admission to hospital. The only thing the Code of Practice adds is to state that the local authority must respond not only to a direct request from the nearest relative, but also to a request on behalf of the nearest relative. So, what does this mean to the nearest relative and to the AMP receiving such a request? The nearest relative doesn't need to put the request in writing, but can make a request by phone. They can also ask someone else to make a request, such as another relative or their GP, and this must be considered as if it were a direct request from the nearest relative. The local authority AMP service has to respond to this request, but this does not necessarily mean that they will conduct a formal assessment. An AMP only has to consider the patient's case. If, having done this, they do not think that an assessment is merited, there is no requirement to assess. From the AMP point of view, there may be many reasons why it's not appropriate to assess the patient under the Mental Health Act. A typical reason may be that other arrangements are being or have been made. This might include a GP referring the patient to the local crisis team for assessment. It would therefore be wrong to preempt this assessment under the principle of the least restrictive option. Another reason might be that the patient is already involved with a community mental health team who are managing the patient's condition and would not welcome an AMP's intervention, or do not consider that a formal assessment is necessary. It may be that while the relative is concerned about the patient has not actually seen a doctor recently, in which case I would always advise the relative that they should arrange for the patient to see a doctor first, if possible. In some cases, the request may be mischievous. In other words, the relative may have made frequent or recent requests for their relative to be assessed, and unless there has been any significant changes in the patient's condition, it would be oppressive to keep making fresh assessments. I recall one such case where the mother of the patient, a pregnant single parent with a young child, reported that she was expressing a range of alarming paranoid delusions, especially around her unborn baby. The ex-partner of the patient also corroborated this. I went out with the GP and a psychiatrist to find her preparing tea for her daughter and a school friend. Everything appeared completely normal, and she spoke politely and rationally to us for about an hour. We were unable to elicit any symptoms of mental illness, but based on the reports of the relatives, with heavy hearts we decided to detain her, and she was detained under Section 2 for 28 days. During that time, she was not given any medication and did not provide any evidence to staff of any mental illness. On another occasion, I received a request from the husband of a woman. They were recently separated. His concerns seemed to boil down to the view that since his wife did not want to talk to him and would not agree to what he wanted to happen to the property and children, then she must be mentally ill. I did not respond to this request. Once an AMP has considered the case and has either decided not to undertake a formal assessment or has assessed and decided not to detain, they have a legal requirement to write to the referring relative. These letters have to be very carefully written. The Code of Practice states such a letter should contain, as far as possible, sufficient details to enable the nearest relative to understand the decision while at the same time preserving the patient's right to confidentiality. If you have been, thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or informative, please don't forget to like and follow.